Good morning, everyone. So this is a video I've been meaning to do for a while. I've been posting a bunch of other videos talking about open hardware like the Librem 5, free and open source software, privacy, and all of this raises the question, why bother with this stuff? Aren't these just technical details that only matter to nerds? And, well, no. And one way to think about this is that there's an important question that people have been arguing about and having wars about for pretty much as long as people have been arguing about things or having wars about things. And that is the question of who makes decisions. Do we have the king make decisions? Do we vote to figure out who's going to make or to figure out what the decisions are going to be, or are we going to vote to figure out who is going to make the decisions? Are we going to have representatives? Or are we going to make individual decisions because we've set things up in a way so that our decisions don't really affect other people, and therefore having people be entirely autonomous in those decisions is a good idea? And it turns out that when you select computer software, and therefore when you select hardware that runs software, you are answering that question. You're answering the question, who's going to make some decisions? And that choice of who's going to make decisions is not just going to affect you, but it also potentially affects other people, even if that's not the thing that you were trying to do when you made that choice. So, one thing that people have compared several times is computer code and law. And in order to do a good comparison of those two things, let me tell a quick story. Imagine someone gets seriously hurt, and you get them into your car and start driving them to the hospital. And you get to a red light, so you stop at the red light, because that's what you're supposed to do at a red light. But then the light doesn't turn green right away. You can clearly see that there's no other cars and it's safe to go, but you need to get to the hospital quickly, but the light is still red. Do you run the red light? And the law says you're not allowed to run the red light. But the whole concept of law is that humans can use their judgment and decide what they want to do in response to the text of the law. The law allows for human judgment. It allows for human judgment at several different points. So as the driver who's sitting in front of the red light, you understand that the purpose of the red light is to prevent accidents. And in this particular scenario, you can judge that because there's no other cars, you know there isn't going to be an accident. So that purpose of the law is sort of irrelevant to your situation. You also know that the penalty for breaking the law, if you do run the red light, is going to be a fine of maybe $100. And you can make the decision that you're willing to risk paying that fine to get your passenger to the hospital as quickly as possible. Further, if a police officer does decide to stop you, they can see the situation, see that you're trying to rush someone to the hospital, and decide to not issue you a ticket and just let you continue on your way. They have the discretion to ignore the law in cases where it clearly doesn't make sense to enforce it. And even beyond that, if you do get a ticket, when you go into court to talk to a judge to contest the ticket, you can explain the situation and the judge can overrule it. So in this situation, it's perfectly reasonable to ignore the red light and decide to keep going. So you press the gas pedal and the car doesn't go. Instead, it goes wah wah and displays a message. Please wait for the traffic signal to turn green. Now, if that happens, your personal judgment doesn't matter. None of the safeguards built into the basic concept of law matter. The software in the car is what controls what the car actually does, and that's true for anything with a computer in it where the computer has control authority. The software decides what actually happens. And the software isn't limited to enforcing existing laws. In that particular case, if it's enforcing the law that you can't go at a red light, that's going to disrupt your day and potentially cause trouble for your passenger. So even just enforcing existing laws is a problem, but software can enforce whatever rules it wants. The car manufacturer could say, enforce a 6 p.m. curfew and say, your car isn't going to start after 6. Or it could say that you can only go 30 miles an hour if you have less than half a tank of gas to make sure you never run out of gas. And these probably aren't things you want your car to do, but if there's a computer in your car and the computer has control authority over the car, then it can do those things. Now, if the code in your device is enforcing rules, device could be a car or a computer or a phone or, I mean, really anything these days is a computer. Refrigerators are internet-connected computers. But if the device is enforcing rules and you can't change the code that's running in the device, then those rules will be enforced. They'll be enforced perfectly and strictly. And whoever is writing the code or paying someone to write the code gets to choose whatever rules they want to enforce. So it's not even that code is law, which was the title of this talk, but it's worse than that. Code is law with potentially perfect enforcement. So it matters quite a bit who controls that software. For many modern cars, that's the car manufacturer. They're going to make it really hard for car owners to install their own software. It would be nice if you could install your own software on a car, but mostly you can't. And a lot of modern cars have cellular modems and always-on internet connections, and that means that the car manufacturer can push a software update. So even if your car doesn't enforce traffic laws today, the car manufacturer could decide that they want to add that functionality in an update tomorrow, and suddenly you're stuck at a red light. And your car won't accelerate because the car has decided not to. Now, no car manufacturer that I know of has actually decided to enforce stopping at red lights or limit you to the posted speed limit, at least not yet, but they do enforce rules in software. The simplest example that I can think of is what happens when you try driving in a recent car with no seatbelt on. In many cases, it's going to go ding, 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 and turn the little light on, and you don't have any control as the driver of the car of that warning. It's just going to keep making that warning sound until you either accept that your car is going to make dumb noises for as long as you're driving it, or until you give in and put on your seatbelt. And that's true even if not wearing a seatbelt as an adult is legal. And where I'm recording it, it happens to be legal to drive a car without a seatbelt. But the car is not going to cooperate, at least with most of the modern cars I've driven recently. But there's more extreme examples. For example, the software in tractors from John Deere validate the serial numbers of some parts and prevent the tractor from starting at all if those part numbers don't match. What that means is that if a part breaks on your tractor and you go find yourself a replacement part, now they put some effort into making it difficult to get replacement parts except from them, but even if you find a replacement part and you install it yourself, you can't get a working tractor as the result of that because you need an authorized technician to plug in a computer device and activate that new part, add the part serial number to the list of allowed parts, and if that doesn't happen, the tractor will not run with that part connected. So that's a pretty extreme enforcement of rules by a computer on what should be not even computer equipment. But this isn't even limited to universally applied rules. Tesla has, with their cars, done a couple of different things. For example, they sent software updates to modify the behavior of the batteries in some cars for Hurricane Irma back in 2017. The hurricane was coming, and they sent a software update to just the cars in Florida near the hurricane to temporarily unlock some battery range. They had sold cars that could go, 200 miles, but that actually had batteries that would allow them to go 240 miles. They just sold 200-mile cars because they wanted to sell them for less money so they could charge more, product segmentation. But for that particular thing, they decided, well, we're just going to change people's cars remotely over the internet. Another example is that for cars that have been restored, for cars that were like completely destroyed, salvaged, and repaired, they've detected that that was the case or found out that was the case, and then remotely disabled fast charging functionality. Now they say that this is a safety issue, but they're still remotely disabling features of cars over the internet based entirely on their judgment with no sort of even clear mechanism for when exactly they make these changes or anything. This isn't them changing their stuff. This is them changing your stuff without even necessarily telling you. An older example of software developers making up their own laws and enforcing them is copy protection for software. copyright law restricts making copies of software and then reselling those copies, but it doesn't ban all copies all the time. Copy protection mechanisms, so-called copy protection mechanisms, do exactly that. They say you can never make any copies. Traditionally, you would have physical disks, and you would be restricted to using the original physical disk that you got. But even now, when we've moved away from physical disks mostly, there are other mechanisms in place that try to prevent this copying. And there are several cases where copies are perfectly legal. So having technical mechanisms that completely prevent that copying is extending the law in the manufacturers or in the software producers' favor. Same thing with music and movies. Now, with modern computer devices, manufacturers take this up even further. You can't install software on an Apple iPhone unless you're a registered developer, except through the official App Store. And to make this even crazier is a lot of these things are supported by US federal law, in that if a manufacturer of anything institutes functionality that is described as trying to enforce technical copy protection, bypassing that protection is illegal by default, even if you're trying to do things that would otherwise be legal. This issue of control is even more significant and obvious for internet services and websites, where the software is running on someone else's server rather than your local computer or a local device. For example, if we consider a website like YouTube, the site staff has complete control over the software that's running on the YouTube servers. And what that means is the software can enforce arbitrary rules on what can be on YouTube, who gets control of YouTube, etc. Absolutely. For example, we have a rule on YouTube that the community moderators can take down videos and you can't. Now, that makes sense for the YouTube business model, that makes sense for the basic function of a video hosting site, but that's something that you are opting into when you work with YouTube. The YouTube staff are in control of the YouTube site. Another example is that they have software that does automatic recommendations. For example, videos with guns in them seem to get recommended less than videos on other topics. Now, that's not necessarily some critical problem that means that you shouldn't use websites, but it's important to keep in mind. Now, the other side of this is that for websites and web services, the control only extends to the stuff that is sort of obviously related to that website or web service. You generally don't have to worry about things outside of the website, but that's not always true, and things get really awkward when you get into situations where there's a local device that's set up to a cloud service. Smart devices or cloud devices are kind of scary, actually. So this brings us back to the question, who makes decisions? And every time you choose software or you choose some service, you're answering that question to some extent. For example, if you use a site like YouTube or eBay, you're accepting autocratic authority. This is kind of like a king. The YouTube staff and the YouTube administration, the YouTube CEO and the YouTube board in the end have effectively absolute control over YouTube. YouTube gets to take down your videos, and they have complete control over what their recommendation system is going to recommend for you to watch. On the other hand, in the complete opposite direction, if you know how to write computer programs and you write your own software and then you run it on your own computer, then you have complete autonomy. If we want to compare this to a political system, this is like individual anarchy. You get to do what you want, you don't have to ask permission from anyone, and you don't have to worry about anyone overriding your choices, at least by technical means. If there's other laws and someone can discover that you're breaking a law, you still have to comply with the laws or deal with the consequences of breaking the law. But it is not the case that someone gets to remotely change how software that you wrote and that you run on your computer is going to operate unless you have some security issue. But this brings us to the scary cases. For example, if you get a Ring doorbell from Amazon, you've subjected your home or wherever you install this doorbell to a autocratic internet service. And in this case, because this is an object that has real world properties, it has a camera that's watching your doorway, this system can override real world laws. For example, the Ring doorbell system has been known to work with the police to ignore the Fourth Amendment. Amazon allows some police departments to access videos recorded on Ring doorbell cameras without any requirement to get a warrant. The police just have to log into the system and they can access all the doorbell cameras in the town or city that they are related to. That's kind of scary. And that is absolutely a political decision that you have made if you opt into a Ring doorbell camera to choose to give authority to Amazon rather than the standard legal mechanisms. In the other direction, there are things like Debian GNU Linux, and if you choose to run the Debian operating system, you've delegated some of your decision-making to the democratic governance of a nonprofit organization. Now, the Debian people don't always make perfect decisions, but the decisions that they do make are made transparently. They frequently vote to make decisions, and they record the votes that they're making. And more importantly, Debian is free and open source software, so everybody who chooses to use Debian, or everyone who chooses not to use Debian, retains the power to go look at what the software does. You can read the source code, or if you don't know how to program, you can have someone else read the source code. And if you do install Debian and you don't like some choice that has been made in the system, you can modify the system and install your own modified version of a program. So that's sort of where I'm going with this. If you want control of your world, one way that you can get control of your world is to install free and open source software yourself. Or in addition to that, you should probably put some thought into who's in control of software systems, what is the mechanism for making decisions in those software systems, and is that what you want to have controlling the aspect of your life that software is controlling. One of the American sort of individual anarchist philosophers, David Friedman, has this idea of a polycentric legal system. And kind of that's the world that we're in now. The idea of a polycentric legal system is that there's a bunch of little organizations that each have their own legal system, and people individually get to opt into a little bit of law from here, and a little bit of law from there, and a little bit of law from there. And if you install Debian on your computer and then use that computer to visit YouTube, you have at least 3 different sort of legal systems that you're interacting with. There's all the normal legal system that we deal with the government, but you're also subjecting yourself to the democratic governance of Debian and the autocratic governance of YouTube. So this does matter to some extent. This affects our lives, and when we get into the extreme cases like cars, this can have very concrete real-world impacts that it's unreasonable to just dismiss as sort of being nerd-only technical details. So if you want links to some of the stuff that I've talked about, go ahead and check the blog post. A link to the blog post should be in the video description. And thanks for watching.